currently I am an assistant county attorney here for Johnson County. Some basic overall themes: don't go it alone. We're going to talk about how to set up the business. Then, of course, the running the business on a day-to-day basis. What sort of legal issues might arise in the running of your business? And then there's additional topics, and obviously there are courses taught on legal issues relating to small business and startups that we don't have the time for. So when I say don't go it alone, there are people out there to help you. Yes, you will have to pay them, but it is generally money well spent. The initial team of advisors that I always recommend clients, aside from if they've come to me, they're visiting with their attorney or their lawyer, but they also need to reach out to an accountant. An accountant is going to look at their business plan or what they're proposing to do as a business, and they're going to give some advice about the proper structure from a tax standpoint. And that then comes back to the lawyer, who then can set it up maybe as an LLC, which we'll talk about in a little bit, maybe as an S corporation. There's a few other options, but by and large, the three main forms of business that a small business startup might do here in Iowa is either a sole proprietorship, that means you're just doing it in your own name, as an LLC, which if you're here, you probably have already done enough research to know about LLCs, and S Corps. But the accountant will provide important information to you and to your lawyer about which form is best, and the documents then are different. Also, I always recommend an insurance agent, one that you can trust and one who's going to pay attention to the sorts of business risks that you're going to encounter. If you are operating, say, a taxi service, that's a whole lot different than maybe a home baking or farmer's market stand, or maybe a day trading business out of your home or something that's online. The risks are different, and that insurance agent is going to shop for you and know what sort of coverage is ideal and recommend that to you. And also, hopefully you've already reached through your social networks and started building a relationship with a mentor. I always think that's important as well. By the way, it's okay to interview them. You don't have to go with the first one. I'm speaking mainly about lawyers, accountants, and insurance agents. They are trying to get your business. So they are essentially interviewing for a job or an engagement, and it's fair to ask them questions. It's fair for you to go to some degree with your gut. If there's not a good fit, it's not a good fit, and it's not going to get better after years of working with them and paying their fees. And it's also okay to ask for references. Also ask your friends. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit later about the right tool for the job, and just because your friend went through a divorce and has a divorce attorney that they trust, or maybe had a workers' compensation claim, those lawyers don't necessarily know the sorts of skills that a business lawyer would, and vice versa. Ask them to respect your confidentiality when you approach them. Lawyers are obliged to protect the information shared with them, even by prospective clients. So lawyers have that obligation. I'm not so sure about other professionals. Also give them permission to talk to each other. I already referred to accountants. There's some collaboration that needs to occur between an accountant and an attorney in setting up a business. And so don't be afraid, because of fees or whatever. We'll talk a little bit about fees in a second. But don't be afraid to say, hey guys, I need you to talk to each other so you can set this up, by the way, quickly. If they're having to go through you, that might not be the fastest, but also you want your attorney to know some of the information or recommendations that the accountant might have. Demand that coordination, promptness. This is all the sorts of things that you're entitled to ask of and expect from your professionals. Speak plainly, be prompt. And then I list some others on the team. Budget more for startup legal expenses than you think you'll need, because there will, depending on, if you're setting up business with a co-owner, a partner, that's going to end, the nature of the beast, it's going to be more expensive, because you've got to figure out who's going to make decisions. You've got to figure out, what if someone leaves the business, wants to get out of the business? What if someone wants to sell their shares in the business, but the other one doesn't? Those are the sorts of things you got to figure out, and it's a lot better to figure out ahead of time than when you're down the road and making some real money to fight over. It's a lot better to make those decisions early on, but it's going to cost a little bit more. One of the things, throughout here, I've kind of bolded or underlined a few points that maybe that I'd suggest taking away. So lots of times when you think about lawyers, you think lawyers charge, well, if it's for like a workers' compensation claim, they'll charge on a contingency. They'll take a percentage of what you get. But generally, lawyers work on an hourly basis. That means every tenth of an hour that they're working on your project, they charge for it. Well, it's not such a new idea anymore, but many lawyers, especially who work with startup businesses, will do it based on a project, kind of a flat fee. You say, look, these are the things I need help with, and they should be able to, if they practice in business law a lot, they should know what the typical things are, and they should be able to essentially quote you a more or less a flat fee. This is about what it should cost. If you're buying someone else's business, that's a different story. Like, let's say you want to get into flowers and there's someone who's a florist that might sell you their business. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is just the standard kind of setup stuff. You should be able to expect or at least negotiate a flat fee, and that's sometimes it's called project-based billing. I'm going to pay you $1,500 to do all my legal startup, which certainly would include, and I talk later about what it typically costs to get a single member LLC started, but that's all the state paperwork, getting an employee ID number, and might even be getting some initial standard contracts. Like if you're a photographer, you're going to have a commercial photography business, you might want to have a typical client agreement. And a lawyer can help you with that, and you can say, hey, I'd like something like that included in my initial project-based billing. Another way to save money is consider and ask if the attorney would be fine if you maybe work up things first and then bring it to them for a final review. Now sometimes, I have to be honest, sometimes I'd prefer as a lawyer to start from contracts that I am already comfortable with. Sometimes that can actually be more cost effective for the client. But sometimes, like if you're going to buy a house, remodel it, and maybe start it, operating it as a rental, maybe you could find a lease that you've tailored to your needs, and then you just pay the lawyer a much smaller amount of time to review it. So that's another way to think about saving money. And even if that lawyer is your friend, insist on a written fee agreement. So I talked about that right tool for the job. These are the sorts of things a business lawyer can help with, all the way from startup through the various issues that arise when you're operating your business, like debt collection. Someone doesn't pay you, or maybe a supplier doesn't supply you on time, and then you're in trouble with your customers. Business lawyer can help get those sorts of things straightened out. But lawyers have specialties. You need the right tool for the job. This I include down here just to remind me, this is the registered trademark. So that's the symbol that if you got a registered trademark with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, that's the symbol that you stick on there. And patent and trademark attorneys is a very specialized area of practice. And so I wouldn't expect a patent and trademark attorney, they could be the smartest person I know, I probably wouldn't have them do my divorce. So when you are looking for attorneys, it's the right tool for the job. I'm not going to talk about licenses. There's a little bit, I think, of that in the program following, not Dan's, but in the next hour, about the licenses you need to operate. But you do need to plan to budget time to get those. Governments are notoriously slow, even local governments. I'm saying that having worked in government, we do our best, but sometimes getting a permit issued takes a little bit of time. And if you've signed a lease that you need to start selling from that location tomorrow, but you don't have your license for another 3 weeks, you're not going to be selling for those 3 weeks while you're waiting for that license. Let's talk about business name a little bit. Do your homework ahead of time, because if you pick a name for either your business, your product, your service, that someone else is already using that's sufficiently similar, maybe even in the same geographic area, but now in the age of the internet, not always. They can sue you to stop, and I would hate to have already printed a bunch of packaging, maybe come up with a website and a logo and all that, only to learn later that there's someone who's already using it, and they send you a nasty letter to stop using it. And then all that money to some degree is down the drain. Unless you want to fight about it, and a lot of times it's just cheaper to retool. But it can be an expensive delay. So do your homework ahead of time when you think about what sort of trademarks you might use for your business or your products and services, and then register it. You can register it at the state level, and that at least gives you some initial protection. It's not quite the same level of protection as registering trademarks with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, but that's a much more expensive, full-blown process that probably most of you won't be needing to think about, at least in the early stages. Hopefully your businesses all grow to the point where you're thinking about patenting processes, you're thinking about trademarking your logos, things like that nationwide. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, when we get to that point, could you give us just sort of a direction to go in for, like you said, for filing for national?
Yeah, so there's if you search on, if you do, I think it's uspto.gov. That's the initials for the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. I think they have pretty good, online resources for what I'd say non-lawyers. Okay. And look through that. The other thing is there are lawyers in this area, both in Iowa City and Cedar Rapids, that if you want to speak to a human being who knows their stuff, you can contact one of typically the business law firms or full service law firms in the area. Say, I'm a small business, but I'd like to find out more, talk about what the process might be and my expected costs for registering a trademark with the federal government as opposed to the state. But I would first start with that uspto.gov.
Yeah.
Yep. Why not just be my own business? My mother-in-law runs a horse stable. She runs it in her own name. She doesn't have an LLC or anything like that. Well, guess what? We've got some other laws that might protect her, but what if someone falls off a horse, maybe gets their head kicked in by a horse? Those are all the sorts of risks that if she's running that business in her own name, she has that personal liability. And I know Dan's going to talk about some of that and the insurance, because here's the thing. Maybe I think I've got it on the next slide when I talk about sole proprietorships. But if you're going to just operate in your own name, insurance becomes critical. Insurance is always important, but it's especially critical if you're going to be operating a business without any sort of business entity, whether that's a corporation or an LLC, to operate within. It's super simple, but you also are exposed to personal liability. There's other different options, and we're going to get to those right now. There's this link down here takes you to the Iowa Bar Association. That's the state association of lawyers, and that's an online brochure that describes the different businesses in a little more detail than we're going to get into today. So the owner of the business, this is the sorts, and it is common at the smallest of scales. My mom has some houseplants that she sells at the farmer's market. She obviously is getting some money from that. She's operating a business, but she didn't incorporate. She didn't start an LLC. She's just doing it in her own name. It can be done, but insurance is critical. Probably the more common form of business operation that you'll see, that you'll talk about with your friends and business network is an LLC. They are easy to set up. They're usually pretty inexpensive to set up. They are less simple when it comes to taxes. They're a little more. There are taxes that apply to when you're operating in a LLC form, particularly if you have co-owners, partners. That complicates the taxation a little bit with an LLC. But they are very simple. I've set up a lot of them, and probably would work for most of you. I don't know. We didn't have time to go around and kind of introduce and ask about what various businesses folks are contemplating or currently operating. But a single member LLC gives you that initial layer of liability protection. But the key is with all of these, one of the downsides with an LLC is people think, oh, it's so simple, and then they kind of ignore or forget to follow the sorts of paperwork that you need to do on an annual and every other year sort of basis to respect that, yes, this is a living, breathing business entity that's separate from myself and I need to treat it that way. Maybe if they're running a little low on their own personal checking account, maybe they get groceries with the money that's in the LLC account. That is ignoring or disrespecting the corporate formalities. It's kind of called commingling, which you want to try to avoid. You want to respect that this limited liability company, just because you're the sole owner, is an entity separate from yourself, and you treat it that way. It's real, like I said, it's really simple to set up. $50 filing fee with the state of Iowa. The form that you file with them has the name, street address, the initial registered office, and the name of the initial registered agent, which in most cases, if you're starting your own business and it's just you, will also be you. It also is good, especially if you are setting up a business with a co-owner, several owners, partners. You want to have what's called an operating agreement. An operating agreement is a little bit like bylaws for an LLC. They're not exactly equivalent, but they're similar. It's the rules of the road and the operating manual for your business as between yourself and the business and the world. So altogether with the state filing fee, if it's just you setting up a simple LLC, you can probably get a lawyer here in the local area to do it for $350 or $300 to $350. So like I alluded to earlier, maintaining the records is less formal, but I always recommend that an operating agreement is adopted, that you actually issue little certificates showing your ownership in the LLC, and then have annual meetings, even if it is just the annual meeting of XYC LLC was held on such and such a date, and we had no new business. The condition of the LLC is good, and the manager or the member manager of the business, kind of like the president, is going to be so-and-so. You elect, say, an officer. And you call it good. That's simple enough, relatively easy to do on a Saturday afternoon when you're not otherwise running your business. And it helps preserve that, not just appearance, but reality, that this business is a separate thing from yourself. Every other year, you got to file a short form with the state. They collect $45 if you do it online. They require $60 every other year if you do it in paper. But there's self-employment tax applies, and like I said earlier, that low paperwork can lead people to get complacent, get a little bit lazy about treating this as a separate entity, and then you get in a bind if someone sues you and they say, no, you know that LLC that you're kind of hiding behind, you didn't really treat that as a separate business, and therefore as a separate entity, that was just you, and you're not entitled to the liability protection that our statute otherwise would provide. Another thing is, if you try to sell your LLC and you've got other partners, sometimes that can be harder with an LLC as opposed to a corporation. You probably also have heard in doing your research, you've heard of S Corps. S Corps, I've done a lot of S Corps. I like S Corps. They may not be right for you. They may be right for you. That's why you go talk to a lawyer and an accountant about your own business, the amount of revenue you're going to realize, who's going to be making that money, what you're selling, what your services are. But they're a little more complicated to set up initially. I kind of like that because it gives me a more detailed owner's manual for my business. Those bylaws I talked about, no one looks at the bylaws until something goes wrong. And when something goes wrong, guess where everybody looks? They pull the bylaws out, especially if you've got co-owners. Pull the bylaws out, and boy, you sure hope that those bylaws are detailed enough that they talk about the situation you're facing. Same costs for setting up with the Secretary of State of the state of Iowa. You pay $50 to file your articles of incorporation. The LLC equivalent of that is the Certificate of Organization. So the Certificate of Organization is kind of that initial document we'll file with the state for an LLC. We call them Articles of Incorporation for a corporation. By the way, at the state level, this even gets me sometimes. At the state level, there's no distinction between an S Corp and a C Corp. It's just a corporation. It's when you file with the IRS that they care about whether you're taxed as an S Corp or taxed as a C Corp. And if you're going to be taxed as a C Corp, please talk to your accountant, because that creates some additional trickiness. There can be some advantages if you're really making a lot more money or making money in ways that a lot of small businesses aren't. But generally an S Corp is what people set up, especially if they're going to be running it, operating it themselves. And you are supposed to have annual meeting minutes, those bylaws, and issue shares of stock. Even if you're issuing stock certificates, a little piece of paper that says 1,000 shares of XYZ Corp are hereby issued to me, if I'm setting it up myself. But those annual meeting minutes, you don't actually have to have a meeting. You can just have a written action of the board of directors. That board of directors may just be you. So you say that I'm elected to president, secretary, vice president, treasurer of XYZ Corp. You don't have to be afraid of it, but you should do it. It's a good practice. Like I say on the slide, stock in S Corp is more freely transferable. So if you're thinking about buying someone's business, you should pay attention to whether they're an LLC, particularly if they're an LLC that they also have a partner, or if they're a corporation. Now, a lot of times co-owners have agreements between themselves that may restrict selling to someone else, but still it's a little bit easier to sell stock in an S Corp than it is units in an LLC. This is the form. You may want to write this down if you haven't already, aren't familiar with it, Form 2553 with the IRS. That's the form that you have to file within a certain period of time in order to get that S Corp status. So after you've started your business, after you filed your articles of incorporation, you don't want to snooze on filing that Form 2553. Now, the IRS has made it easier to fix that if you miss the deadline. So it's not the end of the world. It's just if you're going to an attorney and you want to make sure that they're going to file that 2553 for you when they're setting up your corporation. Now, some problems with an S Corp. There is a little more paperwork involved, like I mentioned. You got to file that on a timely basis. Owners, shareholders in an S Corp need to be human beings. That may sound funny, but and it is funny. But you'd be surprised how many corporations, LLCs, partnerships, trusts own subsidiaries, essentially. What this says is you can't, an S Corp, there are some exceptions, of course, like anything with the tax and IRS, there's exceptions, but it needs to be essentially a human being needs to be the owner or owners of an S Corp. You actually can't have more than 100 human shareholders or shareholders of any sort in an S Corp. But maybe the most important part, we have a really rich, diverse immigrant community here in the Iowa City area, and you do need to be either a U.S. citizen or a resident alien. And for that resident alien, I know the green card status satisfies that. There's also a permanent residency, which is there's kind of a calendar test, which if you're here a certain number of days over the last year and then the years prior, there's a formula for figuring that all out. You meet that resident alien test. And you need to continue to meet that while you're a shareholder in an S Corp. Another thing, I'm not going to really talk about this. If you have co-owners and you're talking about, even if you're 50-50 owners, but someone's going to get like 70% of the profit at the end of the year, talk to your accountant. It may not work with an S Corp. If you're 50-50 owners, you need to get 50-50 of the profits at the end of the year for an S Corp. I already talked a little bit about the biennial report. After you file your company, either the articles of incorporation or the certificate of organization with the state, you need to then get your EIN, your tax ID number from the IRS. Dan will talk more about insurance. It's also a good part of a disaster preparedness plan. What if we have a flood? That means you can't get to your business for 6 months. It happened in Cedar Rapids. So think about disaster preparedness and talk about it with your insurance agent about things like business continuity insurance, things like that. So co-owners, you've got how you got to decide, and it's helpful to write down then, whether it's in the bylaws or in a separate agreement, how our management decision's going to be made. You don't want your partner to be able to fire you and vice versa, generally. Sometimes maybe that makes sense. There's probably times that you'd really want to. When someone wants to leave. What if your partner's with a really smart, energetic college student, but they graduate and they want to move away? What happens to your business? Partner dies. So what we set up, what lawyers call either a shareholders agreement, you wouldn't call it that for an LLC because there aren't technically shares for an LLC. We call it just a members agreement. Shareholders agreement or a buy-sell agreement. If you have a partner, co-owner, 2, 3, 50, you really should think about having that shareholders agreement and do it before you're making lots of money. Because there will be a lot more fighting later if you don't do it and try to make a decision later. So we try to avoid liability personally. That's why we go through all the trouble of setting up a business entity. But you can lose it if you fail to maintain separate corporate records, if you mix your personal and your business assets. Or this is another big one that people kind of don't think about. But when you go to the bank and try to get a loan, they say, well, we want your personal guarantee. Guess what? You're taking that liability shield and you're dropping it. You're agreeing to it because guess what? The bank's not going to probably loan you money unless you agree to that personal guarantee. But that's another way that you lose this personal liability. It's only with respect to that one, say, loan obligation, but you still have dropped that liability shield in that limited scope. Business financing could fill a full whole workshop. We certainly don't have time today to talk about it. If you haven't, you probably know about collateral. Banks like to call that security. So if you sign a security agreement with your bank, that's a pledge. That's you're saying, hey, bank, if I default on my loan with you, you essentially can come get all the stuff that we talk about, my cash register, my inventory, things like that. You can come take that to hopefully set off what I haven't paid you or what I've gotten behind on in my loan with you. So banks call collateral, a lot of times they'll call it security. And if they come get them, it's awfully hard to run your business. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a later slide. Personal guarantee equals personal liability. If you're getting investors or crowdfunding is a lot more popular, a lot more common these days. Helpful to talk to an attorney because you're getting into some tricky stuff when you are going out and getting investors. I could use all the terms of art. It's just going to confuse folks. But if you're going to get investors beyond just like your co-owners, if you're going to sell shares, talk to an attorney. Think about zoning. Unless it's a complete like out-of-the-home service business, if you have a facility, whether that's your home, storefront, whatever, you got to make sure that what you're planning to do there also is allowed under the zoning rules. Now, sometimes you can get a variance or a conditional use permit. That means where the local government says, you can do this sort of stuff that you're wanting to do, but you maybe have to have these additional safeguards. You got to maybe have a place for people to park. If it's out on a gravel road, you got to make sure you got some sort of dust to keep the dust down from all the traffic. But still, you want to check on zoning. A lot of people sign leases either without reading them, without understanding them, without talking to an attorney about them. You try not to sign a lease for longer than a year. If you're a new business, think about how quickly new businesses fail. Most commercial leases will require you to pay the rent for the rest of the time, even if you're not operating your business. And a lot of times the landlord will say, you know what, I know you're a startup, I know you're operating as Ryan's Donuts LLC, but I want Ryan Moss to sign and personally guarantee this lease. If Ryan's Donuts goes belly up 6 months into the lease, I'm probably going to have to pay Ryan Moss, I'm going to have to pay the landlord the rent for those other 6 months. So you want to limit your liability there as much as possible. Try not to agree for longer than a year. And it may be worth it to pay an attorney to read it, say, here's the big potholes, here are the time bombs in a lease that you're being presented with. I already talked about the long-term contracts. You can read this online. But this is what I mentioned earlier. It's a good idea to work up the contractors. For contracts for just about any business, there's templates online. So go grab one, tailor it to your business, pay a lawyer half an hour to look at it and sit down with you and walk through, or maybe tweak it. Say you forgot to put this part in, you forgot to put the part in where you can sue your customer and collect attorney's fees for having to go after them for non-payment. Lawyer might stick that in there if you forgot to put it in. So that's a good way to save some money up front. If you're willing to put in the elbow grease, bring that to your attorney later. If you're getting to the employees, come back and read this slide later. Well, I'm just watching our time. Guard your intellectual property. I've had situations where people were talking about partnering up and they started sharing information, and then the person took that information and started up a competing business. Be jealous of your information. Now, the flip side of that is a lot of times what you think is intellectual property or trade secret, no, someone else can figure it out. But don't give them a helping hand along the way to compete against you. Things that can go wrong. This is a situation with the lease. Basically, if you know you're going to go sideways, maybe your business is going to fail, start trying to find a subtenant. Because if you get a replacement tenant that's as good of a credit risk as you are or better, and you say, hey, landlord, don't stick me with those 6 months that you were going to stick me because I've got replacement tenant right here. They have a legal obligation, although it might be written in the lease where that's waived, but they generally have a legal obligation to at least consider that replacement tenant. A few other things. Co-owners. Can't stress it enough. If you're going to have partners, try to get it in writing, because then it gives you that roadmap for how to figure out when things go south. There's additional issues. So the objective of this program was to make you aware of some of these legal issues. I'm not going to teach you how to handle all of them. But if you go back through this slideshow, here's some additional things to think about that at least you're going to be aware of as you're building your business. Okay, this isn't legal advice. Some things that's worth time taking to do. I'm going to turn it over to Dan.
First off, my name is Dan Wegman. I work with A.W. Welton Briscoe Insurance. We're an independent agency here in town. We've been around since 1879, and we've got a number of people there in every type of insurance aspect that you could need to talk to somebody about. So that's the quick intro to us. I will just congratulate you guys on seeing a class that said insurance on it and choosing to come to it, because that's normally the very, very last thing, even though Ryan would recommend you look at insurance with that accountant and attorney. That's not usually what happens. It's usually the very last thing, and there's a lot that you could run into. There's a lot of hidden costs that maybe you don't know about, or you're just going to end up not getting covered for what you should be covered because you're needing something maybe just to satisfy a lease, and that's all you're looking at. So we'll dive into what I'm going to talk about real quick here. So why should you buy insurance, or why should you look at it ahead of time? The most common reason that people buy insurance is to protect their business or provide defense if something were to go wrong. But you want to protect your property, your livelihood. You're building this business. One simple mistake could wipe it out. The amount of money that can come from a simple claim is, it's increasing every day. So it can wipe out a business. But natural occurrences happen, and you can see in all sorts of research or studies how many businesses closed because they had a fire, because there was a natural disaster, because one simple thing that is out of their control happened and it shut down their business and had nothing to do with them. Again, the legal defense, if something happens, you want somebody there on your side that you're not paying out of pocket to take care of it and defend you. Most people, the reason they get an insurance policy, they start looking at it, they get a lease. They're required. They have to go out and get that basic insurance. But if that is the reason you're looking at insurance, you have the potential to be missing a large gap of what you should be covering. But that depends on, what type of businesses. Like Ryan said, if I'd love to know what everybody was doing, we could tailor this a little bit more to what you're thinking. But the exposure that a restaurant has compared to a flower shop is completely different. A technology company, an attorney, those are many different exposures, and there's many different policies that we'll jump into real quick here. Liability. I'm going to talk about two insurance topics there's 50 different policies out there. There's 15 different types of insurance you should be potentially considering. I'm going to focus on liability and work comp, and mainly because these are where the largest potential claims come from, or you're legally required to carry these types of insurance. But liability, the most basic, general liability. It covers you if somebody slips and falls, gets hurt, bodily injury, or through whatever you're doing, you injure somebody, or you cause property damage. And that's why somebody that's leasing you a space wants you to have that coverage. Because if you burn down their building, they want you to pay for it. So general liability is the most common type of liability coverage. But there's the professional liability. That need or definition has been expanding every year for many, the last 15, 20, 30 years as technology grows. It's not just for doctors or attorneys. It can be a broad range of businesses that would need a professional or errors and omissions type of liability coverage. In Iowa, liquor liability is a huge hassle. If anybody's dealt with selling a beer to anybody, it's a real pain. We're probably the worst state in the country when it comes to liquor liability laws, but that's just another liability you might have. Liability for management and hiring and firing of your employees is a separate type of policy called employment practices liability. And then we get into some other ones, cyber in the news every day in the past, couple years. But that's real fast liability. But is there anybody that wants has a specific question on their business real quick that they might?
Regarding children?
Yes.
So if you're having children, does it fall under general liability and or additional? Is it a separate policy?
Yeah, so there's two pieces I would say to that. The policy basically could fall under a general liability, or your coverage that you would want to have could fall under the general liability. But with insurance, a lot of times they give you everything and then they start taking it away. So they would cover everything to do with children, and then they take away coverage for abuse and molestation, which is a very, unfortunately, a hot topic in insurance, and you see it in news. But so it's covered under that, but then they take it away. So you have to work with somebody that knows what you're doing and add that coverage back. The other piece to that would be maybe a daycare or anybody responsible for, you have a camp. When that child is dropped off and is in your care, if they were injured, that could fall under your general liability. But what if they run away and they're gone for 3 hours and the cops are called, the parents are terrified, and they're just down the block and hanging out in a tree? They, what?
Because that's never happened.
Yeah, exactly. No kids ever just, gone to chase something. But the potential for that exposure wouldn't fall under general liability because there was no bodily injury. The child wasn't harmed.
Right.
There was no property damage. But there's a definite lawsuit waiting to happen because that parent, mental distress, some of those types of claims, that could fall under a professional liability. So when you're getting, general liability, the liability is the big broad term, but underneath that broad
So it gets
umbrella.
catered based on the type of business, and that's where your
Yes.
agent would give you your feedback.
Exactly. That's when you need to, like I said, if you ran in and said, hey, I'm opening up my business and I need $1 million for this lease. Some agents are going to say, well, here you go, $500. You have $1 million, give this to your landlord. But they're not going to know that you deal with children. They're not going to know any of those exposures that you have.
I was just curious about any liability for intellectual property. We work with a writers group, so there's all sorts of, novels, poetry, all that stuff. Is there any liability insurance or anything that we should be aware of?
There is coverage for that. There's coverage on every side. There's coverage for protecting yours if somebody else tried to take it or use it, that you can go after them. There's coverage if you used somebody else's, but those are very specific and unique policies. But yes, it wouldn't necessarily fall under this type of liability.
I was just more worried, if somebody shares a poem on Facebook and somebody else publishes it and they blame our organization for being the middleman, that kind of thing, or I don't know if there was any sort of
There's
something that we should be aware of. Or
there can
That would
be.
just be super specific. We should should talk to an agent.
No, well, there is some, under general liability, there's a personal and advertising injury coverage that's included in a lot. That would more be if you posted something criticizing somebody's poem and then their business got, harmed financially. But as far as protecting intellectual property, that's a pretty specific type of coverage and would be in a completely separate company, not involved in any other normal, policy. But
Gotcha.
and it can be expensive. I just got one for a very, very small exposure, and it was $15,000. So that's
You guys are an independent agency,
yes.
so you can find those different carriers that provide specialized coverage.
We can find basically anything. It's just, this business, their policy for work comp, property, general liability, auto, everything was $9,000, and their intellectual property is $15,000. So we can find everything and that is something we would talk about, on how to get insurance. There's specialized carriers, which is direct writers, or independent, which is what we are, that can go out to the market and work with 50 to 60 different companies to find the best option. Work comp, the reason I focused on this is it's with liability. Work comp is where the extremely large financial loss could come from if you aren't covered properly. You are required in the state of Iowa to have work comp if you hire anybody, one employee. That doesn't mean members of the LLC. If there's 3 members of an LLC, you're all owners. You don't have to have work comp on each other. But if you hire somebody and give them a W-2, part-time, full-time, you need to have work comp. It will cover any and all medical bills that they were to receive because of an injury at work, plus lost wages. So just going to tell you, if you hire somebody, get work comp right away. These were just a couple of the other, but a lot more basic types of policies. Property, cover your property. Auto, cover your auto liability or vehicles. An umbrella is a way to get an extra liability protection for less money, basically. You can go up whatever limits you want through an umbrella. The business specific policies, like I mentioned, restaurants have specific insurance that the flower shop doesn't. Garage keepers is different than a tech company. So there might be something that's unique just to the business you're operating. Directors and officers, or any sort of benefit type of insurance that you would want to put into place for your employees. This is going to be some areas of concern. These are newer or hot topics in insurance, areas where we're seeing a lot of claims, employment practices like I talked about. The number of claims to the EEOC in the last 10 years has gone probably up 50% from 10 years ago. There's just a lot more claims. There's a lot more protections for employees. So there's a lot of new insurance and the new attention to that area. Cyber liability, we've heard about. Targets, we heard about all of that. Professional, I mentioned. And then whether you're actually hiring an employee or you're hiring an independent contractor. You can't just hire somebody and call them an independent contractor so you don't have to take out taxes and you don't have to get work comp. When this gets to the court, somebody gets injured, a lot of times this is starting to go against the business and it's just not working to call them an independent contractor. So we're going to cram this in a couple minutes. What affects the price of insurance? Number one, what you do. What's your risk? Are you building fireworks? Or are you washing dogs? There's a difference in what could go wrong with those two types of business. So number one, think about what you're doing, what could go wrong when you're trying to evaluate maybe what's this going to cost, what sort of a time that you need. The higher the risk, the more time you need. So we can write a dog washer in 2 days. We can write a fireworks company. It's going to take us 2 months. So think about that time frame. Risk of injury, work comp is based on the same thing. What type of risk are you putting your employees under? And then when you get into property, how much property, age, where it's at, those sorts of factors. And then most policies, when you're talking liability and work comp, are based on either your sales or your payroll. So as any of those go up, your insurance is going to go up. So that's what's going to affect the price of insurance. What should you put together before you call or get an idea before you call somebody about your insurance? don't call and say, I'm going to start a business, I need insurance. It's a daily call that we get, but it's not the best way to start, and you're not going to have somebody that's able to really start diving into what you're doing. If I'm thinking, you just want to start a business and it's not going to be, something that is well thought out. Have an idea of your business plan. Know a good idea of what you're doing, what your estimated sales are for the first year. We know if you're starting, you don't know what your sales are, but they will audit it all at the end of the year. But have some idea. Are you creating a product that's going to sell $500,000 in the first year, or are you hoping 50,000 and in 10 years you're going to sell $500,000? Have an idea of what your business plan is and what size you're expecting in the first year. But ask questions. Ryan had a good point. Interview your agent. Ask questions about what that agent does, what sort of resources they have. One size does not fit all. That's probably the number one takeaway. Insurance is not a commodity. Flo can take the box off the shelf and say that's insurance. That's personal insurance. Business insurance is not that at all. This is where we're going to kind of talk about what we do as an independent, or maybe some direct writers. You can buy insurance in two ways. Find an agent that is going to work with you, has the resources to help you grow. Like I mentioned, personal insurance is a lot of times is the box off the shelf. Business insurance should be much more than that. Personal insurance is intended to be there and sit back. Something happens, they cover you. Business insurance should be proactive. They should be giving you resources, telling you how to control your risk, and helping you to grow your business, not just as you grow your business. So you can base it on the carrier, whatever's the cheapest, policy out there, and not know if it's covering what you need, or you can base it on an agent that's going to help you find the best coverage and policy that you can get. So I think we'll wrap it up and just end it there. Insurance is not a commodity. I would say talk with somebody, work with somebody, because your business is different than your business, and it's much more important to protect yourself through the insurance policy. So any last questions? I ran fast as I could through that, but and you can get our contact information. There's mine. I have cards somewhere if you do have any questions after this. So, all right, thank you.